Hi, everyone. I see everybody kind of starting to pour in. Today, we had a ton of registrants, so I'm going to give it a little bit of time to give people time to pop in. I know today's topic, especially if you have kids, is an important one. And I want to thank everybody who shared our marketing stuff on your own personal social media channels. That's really helpful in getting the message out there. Today's message, I think, is probably one of the most important ones we're having in our summer series. So I'm excited to see the numbers behind our registrations. I think that's exciting. So just give you a few more until it slows down a little bit. My name is Steffi Butler, and I work for Mending the Soul. I was introduced to Mending the Soul probably about 13 years ago initially, and have been leading groups. I'll talk a little bit more at the end of our webinar about what Mending the Soul is for some of you that are coming because you saw this posted on someone's page, or you don't know anything about Mending the Soul, you just want to know how to protect your kids. We'll talk about what Mending the Soul is at the end. But currently what I do is I help run online groups, help train online facilitators, and I run our webinar series. I'm a marriage and family intern therapist. I spent several years as an educator, but have been a child victims advocate most of my adult life, and worked with kids who are at-risk youth who have faced a lot of abuse and trauma. So this subject is passionate to me, obviously, and has been for some time. Today's statistical material will be taken mostly from The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker and Predators by Ann Salter. Both Gavin de Becker and Ann Salter are extremely well-known researchers in the area of predators and child predators. But I want to start first with a story. We at Mending the Soul believe that story is an extremely important part of the healing process. And I also think it's just an important part of our lives. I think story makes things more significant and impactful. So I'm going to start with a story of a little girl. Let me start here too, just by saying today will shock a lot of you, and I want to commend your bravery for attending something like this, because I know a lot of people find it difficult to face the information that's out there because it's scary and it's intimidating, and if you have kids, it's super, super scary. If you're a victim, it can be scary because you know what these statistics mean. So as I share today, the story I'm about to share, the statistics I share, I want to give you a little bit of hope that before you leave, even though you're going to have a lot of heavy information, I'm also going to not let you go until you also get the information you need to feel secure that you do have what you need to protect your kids. And it is possible to create a really low risk environment for your kids. So as I share this story, it's not an easy story for me to tell, and I know it's not an easy story to hear, but I would ask that you just engage in this opportunity to learn and participate. If you have questions during the webinar, you can type them in the Q&A box or in the chat box. So this story is about a little girl. She's pictured here with her mom and her brother. You can tell by the hairstyles, this was quite a while ago. And she's right around 2.5, which is the time in her life when her single mom decided to start going to a new church to try and meet people that would help her provide a family environment for her kids. This church sent elders into the home every week to check on the family and whether or not they were being obedient, I guess. And it's at that time that this little girl met a man that would change her life, not for the better. And so at about 2.5, on a probably weekly basis, he began molesting her. And shortly after that, her mom went into the hospital for a massive nervous breakdown and was in the hospital for an extended period of time. And the man was charged with caring for this little girl, driving her to and from preschool. And every day he would take her to a public place, a Dairy Queen parking lot, or a Dairy Queen restaurant, the Phoenix College parking lot in his truck, sometimes in his home while his wife watched, and he would molest her. And this went on from the ages of about 2.5, which is how old she is here, until she was about 4. At which point, he called the director of CPS in Phoenix, who was a member of his church, and gave a partial version of his story. And that person said, do not tell anybody else this story. Go to your bishop. And so he did. And the church then proceeded to try and cover it up and shore it in and make sure it didn't get bigger than they wanted it to be. But they did tell the little girl's mother, and the little girl's mother did the right thing and called the police. And a criminal investigation ensued. There were charges. There was a conviction. There were 60 hours of community service awarded for his crimes against this little girl. This man was 72 years old at the time he committed these crimes. He had several daughters. He had been in the children's portion of church functioning his whole life. I estimate he probably abused upwards of 1,000 little girls and women. When this became public, several moms in the church said, I don't want to know who it is. I don't want to know what's going on. It's too much for me. And I would posit that as protectors of children, we don't have that luxury of pretending we don't know who or what or when, that we owe it to our children to be very aware of what's going on in the world around them. So this little girl is me. And one of the things I often hear that was also said by the predator that came into my life is, well, something must have happened. That little girl must have done something. And my response always is, sorry. How sexual would this little girl need to be to entice you? So today we're going to talk about how different predators think. They're not normal. And you can't reason why they do the things they do. But we can protect our kids from them. And so we'll start with just some statistics on child sexual abuse. In a study conducted by Ann Salter of pedophiles, I'm going to put up some slides for you guys with these statistics because I know reading them isn't as helpful. So in a self-report study conducted by Ann Salter with pedophiles that were in prison, they said that they abused on average around 22 female victims. Perpetrators against male victims said around 150 male victims per perpetrator. So there's a difference there that's quite exponential. And the reason for that is that male-oriented pedophiles are usually much more prolific, but there are fewer of them. So typically a male-oriented pedophile will have many more victims than a female-oriented pedophile. Usually several at the same time. So what's interesting about this study is that it is self-report. And so one of the counter arguments might be, well, they're going to blow their self-report out of the water, except that these perpetrators were also polygraphed and the results were very similar. If you add things like exhibitionism, voyeurism, like a peeping Tom situation, these statistics just get blown way out of the water and are astronomical. So victim studies also confirm these numbers. The number of females under 14 who have been sexually abused or assaulted is somewhere around 28% on a self-report basis. If you add in 14 to 17-year-olds, it's about 38%. Again, male-oriented pedophiles are more active, but there are fewer of them. So studies showed anywhere from 9 to 15% of boys will be sexually abused. So 15% of college females experience rape or attempted rape. Other studies show in general, women report 13 to 24% of a completed rape in their young adulthood. So at a minimum, given all of these numbers, at a minimum, the lowest possible number is that 1 in 9 women will be abused or attacked or assaulted by the age of 18. But in actuality, it's probably closer to 1 in 4. On average, a perpetrator will have 60 victims before he is caught the first time. Pedophiles average approximately 175 victims, and this is based off of that previous self-report study. So some pedophiles are not as prolific as others is basically what that means. Perpetrators are much more skilled in perpetrating the crimes than you are in spotting them. So keep that in mind. So who are these people that abuse our children? There's the bunch of different categories. Psychopaths. Psychopaths are unique in that they don't experience emotion the same way that you and I do. They do not experience empathy and compassion. If they see someone being hurt or even maimed, like when they're in studies, when they're shown pictures, they react to those images the same way you would react to a landscape painting, emotionally and even cognitively. So that's one category of offender. There's pedophiles. Pedophilia is an attraction to small children. It is a sexual attraction to small children. Pedophiles do believe that they are in a relationship with the children and that they love the children. And then we have rapists and violent offenders. A lot of people want to know what makes an offender. And the reality is that, you know, this belief that all abusers were abused or all abusers were victims is actually not really true. The best studies tell us that only 29 to 31% of them were abused. So ultimately, research is inconclusive. We don't know why some people become predators. And as a parent and as a caregiver of children, the why these predators ended up the way they did is not our primary concern. It is that there are predators out there. So I also want to do some myth busting. I think these are things that I've heard, these are things that I've read, and that is I will be able to spot a dangerous person. And the reality is you will not. They look exactly like everybody else. I guarantee you if those statistics on pedophiles are correct, you know a pedophile. And you don't know you know a pedophile. Oftentimes it's very difficult to even use that word to describe somebody because we don't want to believe that those people are in our sphere. I can tell when someone is lying to me. We're going to get into some more research on this, but statistics say you actually can't, that even the very most trained ear has about a 50% chance of being able to spot a lie or the truth. I'll have a gut feeling if someone is a pedophile. I'm going to talk about this in relationship to Gavin DeBecker's work in The Gift of Fear. I do think that there is something within us God created that rises and causes fear inside our gut when we should be afraid. That's our instinct. The way a deer runs out of the clearing if it hears something and it knows that it's danger. However, you will not always be able to put a finger on it. You will not always trust it. And so it's really important not to rely on that gut feeling to tell you whether or not someone is safe. My child won't like the pedophile or react negatively toward him. You know, there's this phenomenon that when I drop my kids off at someone else's house, they always behave a whole lot better for that person than they do for me. Kids want to be pleasing. Kids want to be liked. They want to be obedient. And we teach our kids to obey elders, and we teach our kids to do as they're told. And so if an adult tells them to do something, they're going to do it. And very few children have the cognitive ability or the emotional stamina to fight back or to indicate that there's a problem. Very few children. So this is actually a really dangerous litmus test for a pedophile. My kids will tell me if someone touches them. Probably not. And you need to be really sure that if they do, you're going to believe them. So if your kid does tell you, bravo, kudos to them because that's rare. And if they do, you need to believe them. Pedophiles are creepy and will seem off or odd. In actuality, pedophiles are extremely charismatic. Most of the time they are very skilled at impressing people. And the way I always say this is, if they were any good at their job, which is to con you into trusting them with your children, they are not going to seem creepy. That is exactly what they don't want to seem like. And they are much more skilled in the act of manipulation than you are in spotting it. Ann Salter talks about something called positive illusions. And our positive illusions are our tendencies to soften the world, ignoring and minimizing the bad and overgeneralizing the good. So this looks like that doesn't happen in my neighborhood. I know everybody in my neighborhood, and that doesn't happen here. I choose to believe that there is good in everyone. Not only is that not biblical if you happen to be a Christ follower, the Bible says there is not good in anyone, and that there is no good man, and that the human heart is deceitful and desperately wicked. So not only is that not biblical, but it's not true. We know that there have been heinous people that have walked the planet, and that some people, psychopaths, are limited in their ability to be good. Gavin de Becker says, niceness is not a character trait, it's a behavioral decision. So this concept that this person seemed nice, you should do away with that when it comes to using that as a litmus test for protecting your children. You want to focus on what their behavior is telling you rather than how they seem. Those bad things happen somewhere else to other kinds of people in other places. So I happen to pull up the sex offender registry in my area. I live in an upper middle class part of the Valley of the Sun near Phoenix, Arizona. It's mostly white, mostly evangelical or Mormon, and there are very few registered sex offenders in this area. However, I know of convicted sex offenders that live in this area that are not on the registry. And then you're also talking about the people that never got caught that are not on the registry. So things do happen in your area and you might be unaware of it, but it's important not to segregate, well, that happens over there to those kinds of people. Even my story, my mom was a single mom. She was mentally ill. There were all sorts of things that definitely increased our risk factors. However, that's not to say that it doesn't happen in other places. Steve Tracy in the Mending the Soul textbook talks about the banality of evil. He says, it's highly disturbing to realize that evil abusers often have a banal quality to their existence. And what stands out about banality by definition is that it does not stand out. And this is what I think happens a lot of times when we find out our cousin, our uncle, our pastor, our family friend has abused children, is we think, no, not them. I would have known. And they seem so normal and they're married and they have kids. That is the really disturbing part of this, is that it is common. They don't look different. There's a book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And this book is one of the top selling books of all time. And it talks about why bad things happen to good people. And as human beings, we desperately want to find the reason for this. As a therapist, I'm asked all the time, why? Why did this happen? And the reality is sometimes there isn't a good why. And sometimes there aren't good reasons why things happen, especially when it comes to the victimization of children. So positive illusions we have about ourselves. Most people rate themselves above average in all categories. I don't know if you knew this, but if you gave a survey to every person that you know, they would probably rate themselves above average in intelligence, above average in generosity, above average in kindness, above average in truthfulness, because we like to believe the best about ourselves. Even if we don't think well of ourselves, people with low self-esteem tend to rate themselves above average. And we do this especially when we think about lie detection. So lie detection is a very complex thing, and most people rate themselves above average. However, even professionals like the FBI agents who are tasked with interviewing pedophiles and the FBI agents that are tasked with interviewing terrorists have rarely above a 60% success rate in detecting lies, typically around 50%. So that means you're just as good flipping a coin as you are trusting your natural ability to detect a lie. I think I really learned this when I had kids, because I used to think I was really good at it until I had kids. And I thought, I really can't tell. This is weird. And I realized I'm not any good at it. I can't tell. I could just flip a coin. So there needs to be something else helping you make those decisions other than just your ability to detect a lie or someone that's not safe. Interestingly, women are more vulnerable to men than men to these positive illusions, and predators know this. So predators know that women want to believe that men are good and nice, that we want to believe our kids are safe, that we want to believe that our communities are different than other communities, that we want to believe that somehow because I'm such a good mom, I'm an above average mom, and I'm doing all of these things to protect my kids, so you couldn't possibly be a predator because I wouldn't be in a relationship with you if you were. Predators know that. And then really interesting to the community of people that are connected with Mending the Soul is that religious people are much more vulnerable to these positive illusions and much more vulnerable to believing a pedophile. And many of the people interviewed in Ann Salter's studies, many of the pedophiles actually said, I chose churches because those people believe people are good. I chose churches because those people are easy to deceive. So that is interesting as well. So detecting deception, all that to say, okay, great, Steffi, now you tore us down, build us back up, give us something to work with, right? Experts recommend not using this as the main mode of determining safety because it is incredibly difficult and there is such a low success rate. So the first thing you have to do is identify and monitor your positive illusions. What do you believe about the world? Do you believe that the world is mostly good and mostly safe? Do you believe that most people are going to protect your kids as well as you do? Because you want to monitor that and you want to weigh it against the evidence. And then also, what are you thinking that you're trying to detect? Are you trying to detect fidgetiness? Are you trying to detect risk factors? So it's important to know what it is that you're looking for and whether or not those are the right things to look for. So some of the right things are too much information. A pedophile is going to try to distract you by giving you too much information. So an example might be that the assistant basketball coach comes after you after your 8-year-old son, comes up to you after your 8-year-old son's basketball practice and says, I'm going to take the kids on a sleepover this weekend. Can Johnny come along? And then you say, well, there might be something stirring, and you're like, I don't know, that seems like he's young. Are there other adults there? And so you start to ask questions. And then the coach starts just pouring on the information. Well, when I was a kid, such and such happened. And, my dad used to take us on these trips. And you didn't ask any of that. And so there's this outflow of information that is over the top and unnecessary and not asked for. In that same line of reasoning, a promise made that you didn't ask. So if the coach said at this point, I promise nothing bad will happen. Well, you didn't ask him to promise that. So paying attention to those idiosyncrasies of language, too much information that was not requested, promises that were not asked for, those are red flags in communication. Risk factors. Is this a young man that doesn't have any romantic interest with women his age? Does he seem to play like a child? So all adults, for the most part, will play with the kids for a little bit and then go back to the adult conversations. Something you'll notice consistently about pedophiles is they typically are so distracted by the children that are in attendance, wherever the social situation is, that they do not interact with people their own age or older. That they are preoccupied with the young people. Is this guy, does he have any friends his own age? Does he have a job that tends to attract only children and only specific kinds of children, like 8-year-old boys or blonde little girls between 5 and 7? Are you given time to think? So are you given a flyer that says there's going to be a basketball sleepover, or are you asked to make a split decision right after practice one day in front of your son while your son's begging to go have fun with his friends? Those are two different things. Someone that respects that parent's authority and control over their child will give you time to think and plan and not ask you in front of your kid. Your kid's comfort level could be a sign. If kids are not wanting to go to a certain person, you should definitely respect that. Making your kid hug adults that they don't want to hug, sit in laps that they don't want to sit in, participate in affection in any way is a really bad practice, because what you're teaching them is to ignore their own internal signals for the sake of somebody else's feelings, namely this other adult or your fear of being embarrassed. However, a lot of kids will go with their abuser, especially initially, because that person is like another kid and seems like a friend, and in a way is courting them, is pursuing them. So it will be appealing oftentimes for that kid to want to be a part of that relationship. Be very careful to look for lies, particularly with psychopaths and pedophiles. What normal people portray while lying is not present. So the fidgetiness, the nervousness, the averting of the eyes, that will not be present. And the reason is they actually get off on deceiving you. So what you'll see instead is joy, pleasure, maybe even a smirk, because they actually find great pleasure in the process of deceiving. So characteristics of a target. People are easier to fool if they have a stake involved in believing the lie. And this is what this means. If you have invested in a relationship, let's say your youth pastor, maybe you were on the hiring committee at your church for your youth pastor, you have a vested interest in that person being safe. And so when evidence starts to come out that that person is unsafe, because of your own word and reputation that is seemingly on the line based off of your own perception, you are more likely to make excuses for those warning signs than if you did not have a stake in the lie being true. So I hope that makes sense, and I'll say it a different way. So if you have a vested interest in believing someone, you are more at risk for excusing any of the warning signs that are present. And if you have questions about that, just type them into the chat box. I'll get to them at the end. So subtleties and surprises. So this could be like the same basketball coach asking to do a sleepover. Well, we ended up not going to such and such place and going to this place instead without asking for permission or informing you. There might be little things about the way the person communicates or the way they talk about your child that just seem off. And you don't need to know anything else. Just go with that. Gavin DeBecker says people need to start understanding that no is a complete sentence. Oftentimes I've heard moms say, well, I feel like I need more before I believe this is true. So I suspect this person of not being safe, but I feel like it's unfair to make that assumption until I have proof. So typically the only proof you're going to have is your kid coming to you and telling you that they've been touched. So trusting that initial, like something just seems off, I'm not okay with it, is really important, and not needing another reason to say no. A big one here in terms of lie detecting is emotional leakage. So I talked a minute ago about how pedophiles and psychopaths have a different feeling about being deceptive than people that don't have that disorder. And so the only thing you might notice is emotional leakage. Their facial expressions or words might show you that they are actually not interested in an adult-adult relationship with you, but they're after your kid. And you might see it through a sideways glance. You might see it through a facial expression that doesn't match what's happening. You might see it with word choice. You might see it with body language, like they're spending time with you to gain your trust, but they really don't want to be with you. They want to be with your kid. And so their body might turn away, or it might feel like they're trying to leave all the time. But those things are so subtle, which is why experts say, don't use this as the litmus test. They can be helpful in you identifying what feels off, but they should not be the one thing that you're using. I love this quote. You have the gift of a brilliant internal guardian that stands ready to warn you of hazards and guide you through risky situations. So this is Gavin DeBecker, and his book, The Gift of Fear, talks about how all animals, humans are, a species, are created with something that's instinctual with them, and that is fear. When there is danger, we feel fear. And so he talks in his book about how to listen to that fear and act on that fear. His work in research has shown him over and over again that most victims do have an initial, this is not safe reaction, and they ignore that to be nice, to be friendly, to not assume the worst of people. And then they end up getting victimized because they ignored that fear and went against their internal guide to determine what is safe and unsafe. So as we continue the rest of this conversation, I want you to be thinking about that. I want you to be thinking about people that maybe you have felt were just off, and what that was. I think a lot of times as women, because we are trained to be kind and trained to be nice and trained to assume the best of others, oftentimes we're at the mercy of men. If we're on the side of the road, you don't know how to change your tire, you're waiting for a man to come change it, typically. I think that we are culturally in a situation where we feel like we have to ignore some of those fears. And so I want to challenge that a little bit. I want to challenge that perception. And I also want to challenge the perception that saying no is mean. Saying no is not mean. Protecting yourself is not mean. Listening to your emotions is not mean. Especially when it comes to your kids, right? Like, if you're going to be mean to anybody for any reason, let it be the safety of your kids. Okay, so some risk factors and how to reduce risk. So this is how the experts talk about protecting your kids. You don't have to know for sure that someone is a predator or a pedophile. You just need to be aware that there's a risk and maybe think that maybe. And even if you don't think that maybe the person's a pedophile, these high risk situations deserve some extra thought. Given that statistically, these are places where children are at high risk of being victimized. So a couple of rules: assume everyone is capable, even though many are not likely to be pedophiles. So nobody should be, nobody's perfect. And so assume that even the person that you look up to the most could possibly make that choice. And act that way. And I realize to a lot of people that's going to sound extreme, but as we get into this, it'll make more sense. I'm not saying you have to cut people out of your life because everyone could be a pedophile. That's what I'm saying. So let's unfold this a little bit more. Be present and active. Parents who are sitting on the sidelines of soccer practice, their kid is not going to be the one chosen to be victimized typically, because the adults see this kid is never alone. This kid is watched all the time. If you are the parent that pulls up to the side of the soccer field and lets your eight-year-old run to the field by themselves and you don't stay, that's creating a lot of risk for your kid. So be present, be active, be interactive with the other adults, and be aware of what's going on. Play the odds. And Ann Salter says avoiding high-risk environments altogether and reducing risk in other areas is really one of the most safe things you can do for your kids. So anytime your kids are away from you overnight, so sleepovers, church camps, any kind of week-long summer camps, and I realize this is huge for a lot of parents, some things you can do to reduce the risk: volunteer to be there. Send an older sibling, make sure that you know those adults and that you've been able to interact with them, and measure whether, if it's super important to you that your kids go away to overnight camp and you're not able to volunteer, make sure you know who's sleeping in the cabin with your kids. Is it one adult? It should be two. Anytime a male is alone with your children without supervision, i.e. babysitting, coaches, teachers, I know James Dobson recommends not ever having a male babysitter. That's an unpopular thing, but the reality is that males are highly likely to be the offender if abuse occurs. Women are much less likely to abuse children sexually. Teachers can be a high-risk population. They're alone with your kids all day. It's not unheard of that a teacher would take a child into a back office and molest them at school, but it's a much lower risk situation than, say, a coach or babysitting. Men with unusual interest in children and few peer relationships. They may be described as childlike in that they gravitate towards the kids and play like a child when peers are grouped off together. So think about the barbecue where one of the adults just doesn't ever leave the kids. Maybe their play includes a lot of physical touch. That's to desensitize the kids to the touch. That's to get everybody comfortable. Oh, well, he's just super affectionate. You probably misunderstood what he was doing. I didn't mean for them to take the touch that way. And this creates this fail-safe for the predator where you're used to seeing him wrestle with your kids. So maybe your kid did misunderstand it. So that if anybody says anything, he's able to have a good excuse as to why things could have been construed the way they were. High risk, the internet. I know all parents know this. The average age of internet exposure to pornography is around 5 years old right now. If you have a phone with YouTube or any other social media on it, your kids are targets. That stuff comes looking for them. Adults come looking for them on social media and the internet, and it's a lot to manage. Most experts say it's best to only allow kids access to the internet in a shared computer environment, in the family room, at the dining room table, not in their bedrooms, not in private, not where you're not able to see what they're looking at or what they're doing. This also requires that even though they're at the kitchen table, you be paying attention and active and asking questions about what's happening. Anyone who has ever been accused or convicted of a sexual crime, the wife and or immediate family of the accused, this is especially true if the person has come to the accused's defense or participated in blame shifting. This is hard. I recently had an interaction with someone who felt really bad about punishing the wife of a convicted sex offender. And I've heard this from countless people. Why should we blame her? It's not her fault. Anyone that chooses to stay married to somebody that's been convicted of a sex crime should be a red flag. Anyone who has participated in defending that person or making excuses for that person should be a high-risk person. I shared when I was sharing my story, my abuser abused me in front of his wife. She knew full well what was happening. She had been well-trained to not say a word. My feeling is that oftentimes she was probably sent to groom and help acquire children for him to abuse, which is not unheard of with married pedophiles. Women can be very controlled. We all know women that have been in that situation where they've said and done things that maybe they didn't think they could ever possibly do because they were in a relationship with an abusive man. The research on treatment for someone that has been convicted of a sex crime, if they are put into the top-notch treatment programs and they complete those successfully, the success rates for recidivism, so not offending again, is only around 30 to 40%. Most pedophiles are not put into those treatment programs. Most pedophiles go to prison, and most reoffend within months of getting out of prison. And if it takes 60 to get caught the first time, imagine how many it takes to get caught the second time. So just because they served their time, and just because a lot of people defend them, doesn't mean they're not dangerous anymore. So low-risk situations are school. Typically, there's lots of adults. Most schools have aides in the room now. People are background checked if they're going to be on campus. Having really good conversations with your kids about what did you do at school today, who did you talk to, etc., is really important. An alternative to overnight camp is summer day camp, and making sure that the kids are always with 2 adults, never 1. Any organization that is caring for children should have that as a rule, that no single person is alone with children at any time, because it protects them. Kids activities where multiple adults are present and a rule that there is not alone time with kids are really low risk. Keep devices with the internet in common areas. Don't allow them to roam free on the internet. A couple years ago, there's a kids version of YouTube that was created, and they found that in the cartoons that were being uploaded by some creators, in the middle of the show would be adult content. So it's really important to understand that these predators don't have your child's best interest in heart, and they seek to do harm. And things that seem safe are not always safe. You need to be really wary of that. Teach kids early and talk often about body parts and others' rights to see and touch them. So what does this look like? This came up in our house just the other day because I have 3 little boys, and they like their private parts. If you have little boys, you know, little boys like their private parts. We had a conversation about that's good. That's how you were made. It's a good part of your body. Only you can touch it. Even the doctor can't touch it unless they ask you. And how this ended up was I wanted them to understand why. The why is really important. And so we even went so far as to say, it probably would feel weird if someone wanted to touch your private parts, wouldn't it? And my sons are like, yeah, that would be really weird. Yeah, so if somebody ever says, can I, or will you let me, you just say, no, that's weird, and you walk away. Giving them the verbiage to use, allowing them to think about, why would that not be okay? You don't have to say, because there's pedophiles and people that want to abuse you, you can just say, well, that's really weird. Why would somebody want to do that? And explain it to them that way in words that they understand. All researchers say not to use nicknames for body parts. Use the appropriate anatomical term. If that makes you uncomfortable, get comfortable. Here's the reason why. Pedophiles will nickname the private parts because it's cute and it seems safe. So if you've taught your son to say penis and he comes home calling it a ding dong, you'll have a clue that something has changed. Somebody has given him a new word for that, and you can investigate where that came from. The same is true for your girls and their private parts. If suddenly they're coming home calling it a flower, you know that that's not a word you gave her, and where did it come from? So watch how we speak to kids about them and their behavior. So if you go to pick up your kids from a friend's house, what do most parents ask? Did they behave well for you? I read a story once of a little girl that was being abused by her friend's dad. And when that question was asked, it was super shaming because she thought, yeah, I have to be obedient while I'm here. I have to be complicit in this behavior. So behaving means I didn't fight back. So we're not leaving the option open to our child at that point that maybe the adults didn't behave. So instead of saying that, you can say to your child, did you have a good time? Did you have fun? When you get in the car, say, what did you guys do? Who did you play with? How long did you play for? Did you watch any TV? What were her parents doing while you were playing? In a very non-interrogative way, just as you're being curious about their time. But be really careful about shame-inducing talk or obedient type talk. When I say, hey, we're going to a friend's house, we're going to be on our best behavior, I also make sure to say, it's really important that we're kind to each other. So if anybody is unkind to you or does anything that you think mommy wouldn't like, you can just come tell me right away and we'll talk about it. And that nobody will get in trouble for that. I think too, just to add on this, if we have already started by allowing our kids to say no to a hug from Uncle Jim or a kiss from Aunt Susan, and we've honored their no before, we've already opened up the discussion that there could be a time when I could trust mom with what's happened, because she knows that I am able to say no for myself, and she trusts when I feel uncomfortable. So I can trust her with this thing that happened. And this is a fairly lengthy quote from Gavin Becker. Every day, people engaged in the clever defiance of their own intuition become, in mid-thought, victims of violence and accidents. So when we wonder why we are victims so often, the answer is clear. It's because we're good at it. A woman could offer no greater cooperation to her soon-to-be attacker or the attacker of her children than to spend her time telling herself that he seems like such a nice man. And this is exactly what many people do. A woman is waiting for an elevator, and when the door is open, she sees a man inside who causes her apprehension. Since she is not usually afraid, it may be the late hour, his size, the way he looks at her, the rate of attacks in the neighborhood, an article she read over a year ago. It doesn't matter why. The point is, she gets a feeling of fear. How does she respond to nature's strongest survival skill? She suppresses it, telling herself, I'm not going to live like that. I'm not going to insult this guy by letting the doors close in his face. When fear doesn't go away, she tells herself to not be so silly. She gets into the elevator. Now, which is sillier? Waiting for a moment for the next elevator, or getting into a soundproof steel chamber with a stranger she is afraid of? The inner voice is wise. And I would ask you to give yourself permission to listen to that inner voice. I've talked to many a mom that does not trust her inner voice. My mom's new husband, he gives me the creeps, but I need someone to babysit my kids. The neighbor, my kids really like playing over there. I don't know, they kind of give me the creeps, but I guess it's not that big of a deal. If you have that gut feeling, you owe it to your children to not be nice. Your no does not have to be mean, it just has to be clear. And I would ask you to really reconsider, what is sillier? Sending your kids to someone that gives you the creeps, or saying no? And maybe even saying no to something you really want to do that you need that babysitter for. I'm going to leave the Q&A open. I know many of you might have questions, so go ahead and type them into chat or into the Q&A box. Feel free to go ahead and start with that now. I know I covered a lot of information, so if anything was unclear, if you have questions about anything, you can go ahead and type them. I'm going to talk a little bit about mending the soul. I told you that a little bit of my story, and then I told you that I became acquainted with Mending the Soul about 13 years ago. My pastor at the time was friends with Stephen Celesta Tracy, who authored Mending the Soul, and said, I think you'd be really interested in this. And I read it, and as a victim of not just sex abuse, but my mom, I shared a little bit that she was not always well. It was the most clear, concise, and well-written work on childhood trauma that I've ever read in my life, and I've read a lot. I instantly felt like someone gets it, and there are answers to this stuff that's happening. So if all the stuff I've said today is triggering you because this is part of your story and you want some relief, I cannot recommend to you enough a Mending the Soul group. Kathy, yeah, I'll stick around for a little bit. I recommend you read the textbook if you're scared to get in a group. What we do as a nonprofit is that we really work with wounded hearts. So we have lots of different curriculums that work with different kinds of abuse and trauma. Mending the Soul specifically for any victims of life's hurts, domestic violence, sexual abuse, molestation, rape, incest, neglect, narcissistic families, any of that stuff would apply. It's 10 chapters long. If you take it with a group, there is a workbook, and you work through the workbook just like you would in a support group or a Bible study. And every week you share a part of your story and how you're processing that. It addresses a lot of the inner turmoil that's associated with trauma. So I highly recommend it. If you've been touched by Mending the Soul and you believe in what we do, I encourage you to share with your friends and family our webinar series, any of the information on our resources on our website, as well as to go ahead and give and donate, because that's kind of what keeps the wheels turning for Mending the Soul and enables us to do things like provide these webinars. So here's a question or a statement. Our church youth pastor would talk down to me because I wouldn't let my kids go on sleepovers without me. I had an uncomfortable sense about him. Good for you, Susan or Suzanne. Yeah, if someone, and that's the other thing, if somebody's making fun of your no, they're the problem, right? So Gavin Becker says, whenever your no becomes a debate, you know someone's trying to control you. And that's a red flag for sure. What are some signs to look for if you are worried your children might have been abused? I'll tell you my situation. I was very concerned about upsetting my mother, who was clinically depressed, agoraphobic, etc. And so my state as a 2.5, 3.5, 4.5 girl was my world was consumed with making sure everybody was okay. Nobody was sad. Everybody was okay. So when my abuser told, I actually said, no, that didn't happen when my mom asked me about it. And it took a little bit for me to feel comfortable sharing. Physically, my hands were covered in these little teeny blisters that would crack and bleed, kind of like eczema, but it was totally psychosomatic. I had horrific nightmares. I would wake up screaming. I don't know that my mother understood I was hallucinating, but I was hallucinating. I would wake up throwing up when I wasn't sick because of all of the anxiety. I did not act strange around other people, except for men that looked like my abuser, really old white men in white shirts. So some signs you might look for that we always look for are a child that has been potty trained and not wet the bed for a period of time starts to wet the bed again. Nightmares that have not existed before and have never been an issue. Anxieties that did not exist before that have never been an issue. One of the things we say is a big change, right? So your really gregarious, outgoing little girl is suddenly scared and anxious all the time, or your really scared and anxious little girl is suddenly kind of provocative and wants to be with a specific group of people. Big changes in behavior that are unexplained. Physiological changes, UTIs are a big one with little girls. Marks in your son's pants, trouble eliminating, things like that. I think it's really important that if your child is in only low risk environments and you're seeing these things, to not be alarmist, but to ask questions. Make sure you talk to the parent that is the same sex. So if it's a little boy, is this normal? Like, is it normal for my son to be dancing around naked? Yes, it's totally normal. So talking to the same sex parent about what is normal sexually for that stage for them. And if you're really concerned, talk to a play therapist or a child therapist. We had a session a few weeks ago with some play therapists, and that was really helpful. But if you keep your kids in those low risk environments, chances are you'll be able to identify where the behaviors are coming from because you'll have been there. I think it's also important to be really curious. I think sometimes we're not curious because we're afraid of the answer. And especially if we're childhood victims, sometimes those answers are really scary. And that's why I really recommend Mending the Soul and therapy if you need it. The healthier you are, the easier it will be for you to cope with these situations. Chanel, did that answer your question? You can follow up if you want. Can you give some more ideas for how to preemptively talk to my young kids about setting boundaries for themselves and how to encourage them to talk to me? Yeah, and one of my sons was as well. Because boys tend to be so much more comfortable with their genitalia than girls in their natural state, it can be tricky, right? And you don't want to shame your son so that he thinks that his privates are dirty and bad. You want them to enjoy the beauty of how they were created, which is how we talk about it. We say, like, we're going to be graphic. We're talking about child abuse. My son says, it's like a water gun attached to your body. And I'm like, it is. Isn't that cool? Who's that for, though? And then we always go to, why do you think you have that? What do you think we should use that for? And for a little kid, we're not going to talk about sex yet. We're not going to make it sexual, but they do think it feels good to touch. It can be a soothing thing for them to touch their genitalia, even as young children. When that becomes an issue is when it is mimicking sexual behavior, when it's acting out sexual behavior. So if they're just touching themselves, that's totally normal. They're exploring their bodies the same way a baby does when they start playing with their fingers. The exact same thing. When they start mimicking sex acts, that's a bad sign. That's a sign that they've seen or something has been done to them. Encouraging them that their body is theirs to be appreciated and enjoyed. We talk about our whole bodies that way. Isn't it cool the way you put food into your mouth and it goes down to your stomach and then it comes out your butt? Like, we try to make all of that super interesting for our kids. And our genitalia isn't any different. Shannon, do you need more there? I think the encouraging about talking about it is making sure that you're regulated when you talk about it and that you don't make it weird or scary. If they are concerned that when they share, it's going to freak you out, then they are not going to share. So you need to make sure that you are regulated, that you've dealt with your stuff so that you are comfortable talking about it, right? Because a lot of times for abuse victims, and I've noticed this in myself, I have 3 boys and then a little girl. I'm super comfortable saying penis. I'm not as comfortable saying vagina. That's my problem that I need to fix, right? So knowing that about myself and being willing to do that work for the sake of my daughter is really important. Any other questions? I do want to end with this because I think it's really important. And I want to say this to every little girl and every little boy that's been hurt. And I will get emotional. Well, before I got on, I prayed because I was really stirred by this. I'm not normally stirred by it. This is something I talk about all the time. But I feel like somebody needs to hear this. Your story is important. And it's important to God. And your pain is important. And He desperately wants to heal it for you. And so that's the work that I do and that I believe in. And I believe Mending the Soul is capable of helping you with. So if you are listening and you are hurt and you want help, please reach out and please get it. Please allow God to redeem your story and help heal that. You don't have to live in torment forever. You don't have to give that person one more minute of your time, of your anger, of your shame. You can find healing. And so that is my message to anybody that's listening that is a victim of abuse. You did nothing to ask for this. Predators are sick, evil people. And this is not your fault. And on the other side of healing, I'm here to tell you, life can be redeemed. Your hopes can be redeemed. Your family can be redeemed. And there is healing on the other side. So I do want to close with that. And if anybody wants to stick around, everybody else is free to go. I'm going to stop the recording. And you can check our website for more resources, which is mendingthesoul.org.